I think it's possible to bring creative fire into any situation. I'm going to say this morning that I think what's needed to handle the world we just heard about is a level of leadership that's in us, that drew us here this morning, and that we don't necessarily always believe is in us. So I want to sort of speak a bit about my own experience for a few minutes, and then we'll see about you. When I was 17 years old, I got the Fairfield County Medical Association Prize for Excellence in Biology, with a hope that it would inspire a career in medicine. This is what the plaque said. My grandfather was a doctor in Brooklyn, New York, complete with house calls and office in the basement. I still remember it. My uncles were physicians, my cousins were physicians, and there was sort of a path I was on. And around that same time, in fact, at that same time, I found an article by environmentalists Dana and Dennis Meadows. They had just written a book called The Limits to Growth, and they said essentially that the carrying capacity of the Earth could not handle infinite growth, and that we were heading for a crunch, overshoot and collapse within about 30 to 40 years. People have tried to pick on them for the precision of their forecast, but it was a provocative insight. And I had a thought at that age. I could do something, work with a few thousand people, or be a physician, or I could do something for the whole. And then I had the other thought, who said that? I had this kind of, wait a minute. I immediately started to have to give up things I hadn't even had yet. And it was this sort of battle that I don't know if you found in yourself, where being compelled in a certain direction and also slightly resisting it at the same time. I don't think we move actually easily always into a changed vibration, a changed frequency in ourselves. I think that there are things we like in our comfort zone that we have to actually let go of. And what I'm going to suggest is that what's required is a crossing of a threshold, a shift in ourselves, actually four, that if we choose to make, we will provide the leadership that will be the point of stability in the world that's going to be volatile, uncertain, etc. You could ask yourself this question: when uncertainty arises, what kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person that needs assurance, or are you the one that provides it? When the heat really comes on, what kind of person do you turn out to be? And I believe that that's also the same stance that creativity arises out of. And I don't think that arises out of nothing. I think you have to actually do something in yourself, and I think this has been the challenge. This isn't going to come from technology. This is going to come out of us. So I want to start with a thought on this point. We live in a very mechanistic world, a world that has been characterized by the machine age. We drive change. We roll out innovation. We recharge our batteries. We have human resources. Our language betrays our commitment to a way of operating that's actually based on an industrial age, machine age paradigm. Many of you have heard this. But we still are sort of doused in this. There's a lovely and challenging quote from a Chilean biologist, Humberto Maturana. Human beings presently live in a culture that highly values technological development in an ambiance of competition, mistrust, and control, as if this were the path that would lead us to expand our creativity and well-being. There's something wrong with this picture. Technology is wonderful, but there's a sort of an alternative that we need to contemplate. The alternative is something that has been present for human beings for a very long time. So the quote, the reference to the seminary kind of gives me the excuse to say this. There's a very famous patriarch in the Bible, Abraham, who's the progenitor of all the major Western religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as it turns out. At some point in the Bible, Abraham supposedly heard these words: "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Get thee out. There's an interesting question of what house are you living in? Are we living in the house of our heredity, personally and collectively? And do we have the courage to actually cross out of that? Some years ago, 2 years ago to be exact, I went here to Death Valley in the winter. I don't recommend the summer. It's 130 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a bit toasty. And I spent 5 days and 4 nights without food, only water, in the silence and space of this amazing place. And what happened was a deep confirmation of both the assurance that I felt in myself that the movement that I had been compelled out of was exactly what was needed. There was no doubt about it. And what I felt then, and I felt ever since, is that what's needed is to occupy this place of leadership in ourselves, to actually cross the threshold. It turns out, in old cultures, there are 3 phases of this process, always. A process of severance, of separation from what you know, a crossing into the unknown, and then a return. This is the part people hate. You have to come back. You have to come back. You have to actually enter the world that you once left. But you have to come back different. You have to bring a difference. And there are, I'm going to suggest 4 thresholds that we need to cross at 4 levels. And I'd like to give you an image that perhaps could begin to animate us and help us think about this. There are 4 levels that occupy us, and only 2 of them are things people pay attention to. The actions, everybody's big on that. This is a flame, by the way. The structure is the context we live in, the context we inherit, the context that we're given, that we accept. The tone is the quality of relationship that we have, the qualities of energy, the field that we occupy. And finally, identity. Who are you anyway? I'm going to suggest that there's a transformation at each of these needed. A transformation from manipulation at the level of action to occupying a flow, to letting yourself move more creatively. A transformation from being hypnotized by the contexts to learning to think. I'll say a bit about that in a minute. From being isolated, we each occupy our own separate little space, to actually thinking together. And finally, we have to remember who we are. I think the fundamental disease in human beings actually is amnesia. There's a frequency that's shifting in the world. And there's an interesting question, can we occupy a different frequency? There's changes happening in the world because of this shift. The issue is, at what level are we identified? At the level of the changes or at the level of what's causing the change? This, I think, is the choice that all innovators have to face for themselves. So I'd like to give you an image also for your mind. This is literally an image of the mind, I think, the machinery of the mind. There's a water wheel. These are old things. These are old images. You don't see these too much anymore. Maybe in New England we see them. Imagine a source from the top that causes the water to flow through the mind. And as the water flows, the wheel turns, the cistern fills with fresh water and either grinds grain or makes energy or whatever. What I'd like to suggest is this is an image of how the mind works. The mind, thinking, is a flow. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens is constraints enter into this flow. Fundamentally fear and also shame. Those are the 2 biggies that seem to constrict the flow through human beings. We get scared, so we literally stop thinking, but we can't stop thinking, so what do? We fashion a crank onto the wheel. And we crank our minds into hyperactive gear. Now, you'll notice at the bottom, there's a little bit of algae growing. You could think of that as the subconscious mind. If the flow of water isn't pouring through our minds, well, we run into a little trouble, and what comes out of us isn't quite as fresh and new and innovative as it might be. We're not open, actually, in ourselves. So I want to suggest to you that this equipment already exists, and we don't need to create or change it. Another threshold I'd like to sort of talk about is the change that's coming at the level of the frequency that we operate with. And I'd like to show you something that begins to illustrate that. What I'm going to show you is an image of something called cymatics. It's sound alone. This isn't computer generated in any way. Sound vibration on a plate causing material to change, right? So here's the question. What's the sound moving in you? in your world. So if we could show this clip. Again, just sound. This is sand and something called lycopodium spores, a kind of a mold. The sand forms the lines, the spores form into the middle. Each material has its own way of responding to the vibration. And I think this moves at lots of levels. This is microscopic, but it could easily be thought of as macroscopic, or moving at a much larger level. Finally, I'd like to talk with you about this last territory, from amnesia to identity. So some years ago, I introduced my son, who's now 14, right at the edge of the digital age, to an astrophysicist. And this is a fellow, this is many years ago, he was 5 years old at the time. And he was doing astrophysics underground, about 1,500 feet below the Earth. And he'd created an instrument to detect dark matter. Now, there's controversy as to whether there's such a thing and whether you could create a detector for it. But nevertheless, so I decided not to try and explain that part. I simply said to him, this is a man who studies the stars, the moons, the planets, and the origins of the universe. And he paused for a minute and he said, there are not many men who think about those things. There are not many men who think about those things. 5 years old. The insight that arises out of a child is coming from this core of identity. It hasn't been covered over like it has in many of us. The interesting question is, what is holding up this dust, right? I have a body, but I'm not my body, right? I have a mind with equipment that maybe could work through with a bit more of a flow and less of a crank, but I'm not my mind either. I have feelings, but I'm not my feelings. I am, you could say. Right? Where does the creative fire come from? The threshold to cross is to step into that presence and dare to do it. I think in that sense, each of us, each of you, need to provide leadership. That is the leadership that's necessary and missing in the world. Some questions to just contemplate. What's the threshold you need to cross in yourself? What's the quality of tone you express? What does it take to relinquish your false identities, the ones that aren't actually you? And what's at risk for you if you actually did it? Thank you very much.